start off with an apology. I have to leave in about 20 minutes. I'm on a university committee that requires me to be there. But without further ado, let me get into human capital investment in China. So I want to motivate economic development with a graph that's kind of commonplace in a fairly standard macroeconomics textbook. So if you look over the last 500 years or so, for the most part, economies have had very long periods of stagnation, till about 1800 or so. And then starting off at that point in time, they've had takeoff. The green line right here represents the path that the United States took. And the bluish line out here represents the path that China took. Okay, so this would be China's economic development over the course of the last few decades or so. What's kind of remarkable is the fact that economic development typically is associated with dramatic increases in stocks of human capital. So over this period of time, the United States experienced growth in schooling that was rather remarkable, going from about 2 years of schooling in 1800 to about 13 years of schooling today. And China's development has obviously been lagging behind. But the takeoff from about 1980 or 1985 onwards has been rather remarkable, almost exponential. And so a lot of economists and social scientists more broadly think that human capital has something to do with it. So what is human capital? So this is something that dates back at least to Alfred Marshall. Alfred Marshall had this rather remarkable comparison of the child of an artisan and the child of an unskilled laborer and how well they'll do in life. I'll come back to how this relates to China, but he had in mind that one of the most important components of capital is actually human capital. And the kind of idea that we have is that labor that is skilled in production can operate machinery a little more easily. And we also have this view that human capital or labor that can create new ideas and new methods of economic activity. So, but human capital per se is deliberately accumulated. It's accumulated between the ages of 0 and 6 when you're with parents. It's accumulated at a later stage at the schooling component, and then there's job training. Okay? So I would think about it as 3 components. Very early on in life, it's health, and then there's schooling, and there's on-the-job training. Numerous economists have written about the importance of human capital. So Bob Lucas, who won the Nobel Prize for Rational Expectations, wrote about human capital and economic growth, thinking about human capital as one of the main engines of economic growth. There's a very well-known article by Mankey, Romer, and Weil, where they thought about differences across countries in output per capita and how that relates to measured stocks of human capital. And recently, a lot of economists believe that investments in health and investments in education are very important in their own right, but early investments in life lead to investments later on in life. And that these differences across individuals at a given point in time can be traced back to differences very early on in their life. So the one thing I'd like to point out is, many of these economists, Alfred Marshall, Bob Lucas, Gary Becker, they're kind of all Chicago economists. Typically, you'll hear Chicago economists saying we don't want governmental intervention. This is one exception. Human capital is one of those instances where I think there's pretty much agreement, rather broadly, that there are frictions. It's really hard to invest optimally in your human capital investments. When you're young, it's possible that your parents need to be making decisions, but it's hard for the child to borrow against the parental income. And there are various other arguments of the sort of externalities that justify governmental intervention in education. Okay, so in poor countries, education and health is very poorly provided. There's a lot of debate in the literature on the way in which causality goes. Some people believe that as countries become richer, they provide better health and more education. Others believe that it's the other way around, that is, greater investments in health and greater investments in education lead to higher growth. And kind of thinking about models of poverty traps and investments in education has kind of been a long-standing interest in economics. Okay, so in order to kind of focus thoughts, I want to think about a very simple production function. Any of you who've taken a very basic economic course would have seen that output at a given point in time can be produced using capital, and instead of labor, I'm going to throw in human capital. That's kind of the way I'm going to think about it. You can either invest in what I'm going to call physical capital, or you can invest in human capital. So you could save for 2 reasons. And your savings could be allocated to different forms of investments. You can either allocate it to physical, or you can allocate it to human capital. How do we measure human capital? So I'm going to start off with very ad hoc measures. You can easily use literacy rates, and the most commonly used measures are primary schooling and secondary schooling enrollment rates. You can use measures of vocational training, and I'm also going to talk about enrollment ratios in the primary and secondary school. Regardless of how you look at the data in a cross-country fashion, these investments in education turn out to be a wonderful thing. Okay, so here's a very brief plot across countries. If you look, there's a modest correlation, I would say, between how much a country spends on primary schooling and its enrollment ratios in primary schooling. What's more remarkable is this graph, which was the basis for a very well-known paper by Mankey, Romer, and Wow. So they noted that once you you look at different countries, which is measured in the x-axis in terms of GDP per capita, and on the y-axis we have their secondary schooling enrollment rates, there's a very strong correlation. It's closer to 0.8 or so between secondary schooling enrollment rates and measures of GDP per capita. And so their view of the world was one in which it's basically like a simple growth model in which you're investing, and the more you invest in human capital, the more you grow. It's kind of like the solo growth model, which some of you might have seen, which is augmented to think about human capital. Okay, so before I turn to China and compare it to the United States, are there examples from economic history where economies have invested a lot in human capital? So Japan was one instance where, in fact, some economists accuse them of having invested way too much in education relative to physical capital, and I'll compare that with the United States. But their phenomenal growth after World War II, in large measure, has been attributed to human capital. Lots of economies which are called the East Asian tigers, so Korea, Taiwan, and Malaysia, and so on, in Hong Kong, they've grown and they've invested dramatically in schooling. What's kind of remarkable with some of these East Asian tigers is their growth in schooling over a 40 or 50-year horizon mimics what the United States experienced over 200 years. And right now, African countries and many of the BRIC countries are investing. Okay, so where is China at in terms of public expenditures in education? So the world average in 1995 was a little more than 5%. Okay. So about 5% was the average of public expenditures in education relative to GNP. China was at half of that. 2.5% of GNP. Okay, so by way of comparison, Malaysia and Singapore were closer to 4.7. Poorer countries like Pakistan were at 2.8. Brazil is investing very heavily at 5.1. The United States is at 5.4. Okay, so if you were to imagine that growth is going to come because of investments in education, one place where it would start is by governmental investments in education. And that's rather low in China relative to the world average. So in 1995, China spent about 2.5% of GDP on schooling. In 1995, China spent 30% on investment in physical capital. Okay, so there's a huge difference between the allocation of resources towards investments in physical capital in China versus investments in human capital in China. If you look at the United States by way of comparison, the United States spent almost twice as much as its fraction of GNP on education, and half as much almost on investments in physical capital. Okay. So in China, especially in the last 2 decades, there's been a much stronger focus on investments in physical capital, machinery, equipment, buildings, and structures, as opposed to humans. So here's a graph that indicates time series. If you look over time in terms of governmental appropriations as a percentage of GNP, it kind of went down a little bit from 1991 at 2.9% to 2.5%, and it started to rise more recently. If you look at private educational expenditures in China, so you can ask the question, out of the total funds devoted to education, how much is coming from the government? That's been falling over time. So in 1991, about 85% of total educational resources came from the government. And it's gone down to a little less than 2/3 in 2002. By way of comparison, in the United States, over 90% of educational expenditures are public. Much less is private. Okay, why is this even an issue? I'll get to that in a few seconds. But again, total expenditures in education in China have gone from about 3.5% to closer to 5%. Okay, so clearly, the private investments in China in education has been rising over time. I'm going to skip over this. If you look at gross enrollment rates in schools, either compare ages 12 to 14 or ages 15 to 17, they've been rising. So clearly, enrollment rates in the secondary schooling level, enrollment rates in the tertiary schooling level they've been going up. For instance, ages 18 to 22, it was virtually non-existent at about 3.5% in 1990, and more than tripled to 13% in 2001. I mean, China still rations tertiary schooling, so not everyone who wants to get into tertiary school can kind of get it at this point in time, but they've got to make investments early on in order to get to that point. One other remarkable feature about investments in human capital, investments in education, is the inequality in educational spending. So a brief history as far as the United States is concerned will help. One of the driving forces behind the growth in the United States over the 20th century was not just the fact that the United States invested a lot in education in circa 1900 to 1920, but they also made sure that inequality in educational expenditures was one of the lowest relative to most of the industrialized nations. Okay, so let's see how this compares with, say, China. In China, you have very large differences in per pupil educational expenditures. It turns out that the place of birth in China is a very, very important determinant of your skill level when you become an adult, or your wages when you become an adult. Okay, so this creates really large regional disparities. And the kind of the issue is in the United States, we have this famous theory by a public economist called T. Boo, who essentially argued that even though you have public education, you can move to a community that you so please in order to take advantage of the schooling quality in that particular community. So effectively, it mimics a private allocation. In China, though, you're charged because of the hukou system, I'm sure I'm mispronouncing it, of the registration system, you're charged in excess of more than 10 or 20% of your income when you move from one place to another if you want to send your kid to another school, which you deem is better for your child. And these disparities are just staggering. So if you're in Beijing in 2001, per pupil expenditures are a little more than 10,000 yuan. Okay. But if, for instance, you were in Henan or even Hubei, it's about a 10th or about a 15th of that particular value. Okay. So these, depending on where your kid's born, you're either spending 10 times as much or 1/10 of what someone in Beijing is going to be spending. And those are going to lead to huge disparities. And if you move from one place to another, you're effectively taxed. So you choose not to move. And within China, if you compare per pupil expenditures, there's a very, very strong correlation, aside from, say, Beijing, between these GDP per capita within China, interregional GDP per capita, and expenditures. And many economists have kind of argued that for China to actually progress, it is extremely important to kind of diminish this degree of inequality. Okay, so let me turn to what I consider is an interpretation of these lines. When one's thinking about how much to invest in education, what we teach, what we learn from economics is you want to think about what the private rate of return to education is and what the social rate of return to education is. It turns out in the United States, the private rate of return to education is about the same as the social rate of return to education. Both are at about 8%. This is for an additional year of schooling. So there are human capital theories that kind of ask the following question. If you acquire an additional year of schooling, how much extra in terms of wages are you going to get? These private rates of return in China for an additional year of education are at 4%. And the comparable number for the United States is 8%. So taken at face value, this in fact suggests that China is investing way too much in education because the rate of return is so low. Okay. Well, what's gone on in China is that wage policies, interregional migration policies, and so on and so forth, have guaranteed a very low rate of return to skilled labor. And in fact, Chinese economists who have measured the social rate of return to education in China, it's at about 30% for a year of schooling. And that's on the low side. Okay, so the social rate of return to another year of schooling is at a staggering 30%, which means that if you want investments to education to occur, people are not going to be doing it on their own. Because when you or I think about making an investment, basic economics would say, you and I take into account the private rate of return, which is at an appalling 4 to 6% in China. But if the societal rate of return is going to be at a staggering 30 to 40%, 30 is an underestimate, then what's basically going to happen is for the government to have to invest in order for China to grow. So what's essentially people have tried to measure the marginal product of labor directly, and that turns out at about 10%. Okay? So which is kind of why you see a social rate of return of about 30 to 40%, but a private rate of return of about 4%, so which is about a tenth of what their marginal products are. So essentially what's going on is people are very efficient in terms of what you're producing. The returns to human capital are kind of high, but these returns to human capital are high at a societal level and not at a private level. And consequently, privately, you don't think it's optimal for you to invest, and the only way that these investments can kind of occur if they're going to happen at the society level. So if you look at the societal rate of returns for investments in physical capital, they're actually no different than the rates of return that you observe overall. So I believe, and this is an inference based on some analysis, certainly not as deep as it could be or should be, to draw such bold conclusions, but current levels of human capital investments, in my view, are way too low. And these investments have an extremely high degree of inequality, way higher than anything we observe in the United States, way higher than anything we've observed in economies that have developed. So one fact, which is kind of an interesting fact, is if you go back and look at the history of the United States in terms of educational expenditures, at the turn of the 20th century, most of the educational expenditures went to primary education. And as economies developed, the United States went and decided to allocate resources to secondary and eventually tertiary education. Many of the BRIC countries, and China is no exception, have started to invest in higher education to begin with, which of course benefits very few, which further increases inequality. So for China to develop, I think that these investments, the degree of inequality in these investments needs to go down. And more open labor markets, greater, more equitable government subsidies to education, fewer restrictions in mobility, all of these are going to enhance China's human capital going forward. Thank you.